Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to my September wrap-up. Today I'm going to be talking about all the books that I read during the month of September. So I read 12 books in the month of September. I didn't manage to get through quite all of the things on my holiday TBR, but I did read quite a few of them. So we'll get straight into the books, and I'll start off as usual with the classics. Nick and I listened to a couple of audiobooks together while we were away on holiday, and one of the ones we listened to was Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne, which I absolutely loved. I've never read any Jules Verne before, and I just thoroughly fell in love with his writing style and with this story. Jules Verne is a 19th century French writer, and Around the World in 80 Days is a really interesting novel. It follows a man called Phileas Fogg, who is an Englishman. He lives in London, and on the same day that he employs a new manservant who is a Frenchman called Passepartout, he also hears some men at his club discussing the fact that they don't think it's possible to go literally around the world in 80 days. They read it in the newspaper and they just don't believe it's possible. And Phileas Fogg says, I think it's possible, so I'm going to do that. And then promptly travels around the world with his manservant to see if he can get around the world in 80 days. It was really, really fun and really, really enjoyable and really interesting too, I think, to read. I haven't read that many 19th century French novels. I've read Les Miserables, and that might be it. That might be it. And especially because Around the World in 80 Days, the central character is an Englishman. And then obviously I've read a lot of Victorian literature, but it's quite fun to read a French novel from the same time period, which kind of examines Victorian England, or at least Victorian English culture, I suppose. Especially because Phileas Fogg is in many ways a bit of a, not exactly a caricature of an Englishman, but he has a lot of very typically English traits. He's very much like stiff upper lip, incredibly calm, constantly polite, very, very chivalrous, but also quite like unemotional. And it was just really interesting to read a kind of perspective on Victorian Englishness from a French writer. I also just found it really interesting to read about all the different places that they travel to. I also really like the character of Ayuda, who is an Indian woman that they meet in India and kind of comes with them part of the way. And her kind of plotline and story was really, really nice and quite pleasantly surprising for a 19th century novel. So yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed Around the World in 80 Days and would heartily recommend it. And I'm definitely going to be reading more novels by Jules Verne in the future. Another classic that I read in the month of September was Mariana by Monica Dickens. Monica Dickens was the great-granddaughter of Charles Dickens, and I thoroughly enjoyed this novel. It follows the life of a woman called Mary. In the first chapter, it is 1940 and she hears on the wireless that her husband's ship has gone down. She has no idea whether or not her husband is alive, and in the kind of sleepless night that follows, she like looks back on the whole of her life which led her up to this point. And so we go back to her childhood and her youth and look at sort of what it was like to be a young woman growing up in the 20s and 30s. I really enjoyed this. I thought it was really interesting and very funny at times, but also with this kind of dark overtone hanging over the whole book, because you don't know whether or not her husband lives, and you also don't know who her husband is because he isn't named in the first chapter, and so every time she meets a man you're like, well, could it be him? It's just really interesting. The introduction to this novel describes it as a kind of 1930s Bridget Jones's Diary, and I can kind of see that in that Mary kind of struggles to make the right decisions in terms of her career and her love life. She is kind and nice, but she's not like especially talented at anything, and she's quite kind of socially awkward at times. But it also felt like it wasn't quite like Bridget Jones, because there was this kind of like dark theme of the Second World War kind of hanging over the whole book, which I thought was really well done. So yeah, would definitely recommend this one. I also read The Valley of Bones by Anthony Powell. This is the 7th book in his series The Dance, the Music of Time, which I'm currently hosting a read-along of over the course of a year. I really enjoyed this. I won't say too much about it here because it is the 7th book in the series, and I will be making a full video review of it, which will go up in the next week or so. But I really enjoyed this one, especially because now we're kind of working through history in the Second World War, and I found the way this book looks at the kind of Second World War and life in it was just really interesting. So yeah, would definitely recommend this series. It's great, and my full video review will be coming soon. Moving on to the contemporary reads. This month was quite a month of historical fiction set in 19th century America. 4 out of the 12 books I read were historical fiction novels set in 19th century America, so we will talk about them. The first was Washington Black by S.E. Edgeguan, which I really loved. This was longlisted for the Man Booker Prize, and Thirteenth Tale very kindly sent me a review copy of it. It was also shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, and I really hope it wins. It is the only one of the shortlists that I've read, but I still really hope it wins because I thought it was really great. It follows the life of a young man called Washington Black, who is born in slavery in early 19th century century America. The book begins with the death of his old master, and in his place comes one of his sons who is incredibly cruel, much more so than the previous master, and sort of makes the slaves working on the plantation's lives even worse. But soon comes another brother, Titch, who takes an interest in young Washington Black, and Titch is a scientist and takes Washington to help him with his experiments because he is the right size to fit in a kind of hot air balloon contraption that Titch is building. And he also soon discovers that Washington Black can draw really well. He can't read or write at this stage, but he can draw, and Titch begins to use Washington to sort of help him with his scientific endeavours. And then various other things happen and go down, and it ends up with Washington on the run. There is a lot that I really love about this book. I think it deals with issues of slavery and sort of being a runaway slave really, really well. And it also combines that with a lot of other really, really fascinating themes. The book takes you around a lot of different places in the world, from the Caribbean to America to the Arctic to London and Morocco. Like, as well as being a really kind of deep, meaningful, powerful read, it's also a brilliant adventure story that keeps you like turning the pages as you go through. I also really love the way the book looks at science, both in terms of Titch's investigations and also later when Washington becomes like really interested in marine biology. I thought that was just like a really nice other theme that was quite unusual and I really, really enjoyed. I love the writing style. It felt very Dickensian to me in a way that I really, really enjoyed. I will say that I found the ending a tiny bit anticlimactic, but I think that's kind of the point. Overall, I thought it was an absolutely brilliant read. I read it in a single day on holiday and it was really, really gripping, really, really engaging and really, really powerful, and yeah, definitely one I would recommend, and I really do hope it wins the Man Booker Prize. So from a runaway slave narrative that I really, really enjoyed to one that I really didn't, this is The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. The Underground Railroad follows a slave called Cora who runs away from her plantation and kind of follows what happens to her afterwards. But The Underground Railroad isn't really a historical novel, and I didn't realise the extent to which it wasn't a historical novel going into it. So I had quite a lot of issues with The Underground Railroad, which I feel is quite an unusual opinion. This has got a lot of praise and a lot of love, and I do think there were some quite personal reasons or some quite English reasons why I didn't really enjoy it, and also I think a lot of the reason why I didn't enjoy it was to do with my expectations and what I thought it was, and also I don't think it was helped by the fact that I read this literally back to back with Washington Black, and I enjoyed Washington Black much more, and obviously they do deal with quite similar themes. Basically, I really love historical fiction, and I thought The Underground Railroad was historical fiction, but it's not really. What I knew about The Underground Railroad going into it was that it was about a slave called Cora who was running away, and I knew that Colson Whitehead had made the Underground Railroad a literal railroad rather than a kind of series of interconnected safe houses, etc. I knew that, but I didn't know about all of the other speculative elements in this book. And I was quite far through this book before I realised about them, which for me was a really, really big issue. So basically, not only is the railroad made into a literal underground railroad, but he messes with time a lot in this book. So Cora travels through various different states, and every state is kind of like a different bit of American history, and also he just messes with history and uses it quite loosely as an inspiration rather than actually being historical. I didn't realise that going in, and basically I was about halfway through the book thinking, this doesn't feel quite right to me. This feels like certain things feel a bit anachronistic or things don't seem to quite fit. And then I started looking up some things he was talking about and realising that they weren't real historical events, or that he has sort of taken things from early 20th century history and put them into the 19th century and kind of squished time about. If I had gone into this book knowing that, it might not have bothered me so much. But it bothers me that I read the majority of the book without realising. Like, I thought that the only thing was speculative or inaccurate about it was making the Underground Railroad literal, which I didn't see the point for either. Like, that for me served no purpose. But I suppose it does serve a purpose if it's to show that nothing else is historically accurate either. I just would have rather read a historical fiction novel, and I didn't realise it was quite as speculative / messing with history as it was. I don't mind my historical fiction not being entirely like historical. I like lots of historical fiction with elements of magical realism in, for example The Watchmaker of Filigree Street or The Miniaturist, but I like that because I know that the magic is not historical and I'm aware what is historically accurate and what isn't. Whereas when I read this, I just didn't know, and that bothered me. As I said, I think the main reason why I didn't like it is because I was expecting something slightly different, and also because I just don't know that much about this history. It was interesting, I was having a really long chat with Marissa over at Blatantly Bookish about this book, and she is from the States, and she was saying, like, if you go into this book as an American, because you're likely to be so much more familiar with the history, it's much clearer to you much earlier on that he is playing with time, because you know about these things. And also, potentially, if you're American and you've read a lot more books about the Underground Railroad before, this is like really refreshing and different. Whereas for me, I don't know very much about the Underground Railroad. I had literally never heard of it until about 2 years ago. It's not something I ever learned about in history at school. The only bit of American history I've studied is 19th century America, but I looked at like going west and the relationship between Native Americans and settlers. And I've never looked at the history of slavery in America at all. And so for me, I didn't get it. And there wasn't, like, there's not even an author's note to explain what he's doing. And for me, for a historical novel, but that's the thing, I suppose it's not a historical novel, but I was expecting it to be, and I didn't realise. And I think if I had known more about the history or known what this book was going into it, I might have had a better opinion of it, but as it was, I found it confusing and quite frustrating. So it just wasn't for me. I think that's the main thing. It wasn't for me. Moving on to another historical novel set in 19th century America, and this one that looks at the actual Underground Railroad in a more historically accurate way, and that was The Floating Theatre by Martha Conway. I really, really enjoyed this book. It's about a young woman called May. She's 22, she is a seamstress, and she has been working with her cousin, who is an actress, when a disaster on board a steamboat kind of means she has to find a new life for herself, and she ends up getting work as a seamstress and sort of administrator and publicity person on a touring theatre boat called the Floating Theatre. This boat travels up and down the Ohio River, stopping off at various towns and giving performances. 1830s America, the Ohio River was the border between the southern states where slavery was still legal and the northern states where slavery was not, and May kind of gets involved in the Underground Railroad and sort of ferrying people across the river, which I found really, really interesting. It's a really, really compelling narrative, really, really wonderfully written, and really, really historically fascinating. I also just like love the way that Martha Conway writes about the theatre and found it really interesting, and I also loved May as a main character. I thought she was really, really interesting and had a very different perspective. She is quite socially uncomfortable and struggles in social situations. She's also very, very literal and direct. She really struggles when people use sarcasm or metaphor or jokes, and she also really, really struggles to lie, but as she kind of becomes involved in the Underground Railroad, she has to kind of find a way to lie. She's a very, very interesting character, and I thought she was just really, really well done. So yeah, would highly, highly recommend The Floating Theatre, but definitely a really good read. And I also read At the Edge of the Orchard by Tracy Chevalier, another book set in 19th century America. Now I have quite mixed feelings on this, because this is my third Tracy Chevalier, and neither this nor The Last Runaway, which is the second book of hers that I read, have at all lived up to The Girl with the Pearl Earring. I enjoyed both of them, but they just didn't blow me away in the same way. So it basically looks at this family called the Good Enough family. These parents, James and Sadie, who are absolutely horrible, awful people who hate each other and seem to hate everyone around them. But to be fair, they live quite a miserable life. Not much fun living in the Black Swamp trying to grow apple trees. They never seem to have enough food. They work really, really hard for what seems like no reward, and they sort of hardly see anybody. It's a very sort of isolated location and life that they lead. Sadie is addicted to Applejack. She is very often drunk, and she also kind of has affairs, and James is quite sort of violent. And then it also looks at their children. I think one of the reasons why I struggle with this book is that either it seemed to take a while to get to the point, or it seemed to take a while for me to realise what the point of it was. It slightly skips back and forward in time, but the first skip in time doesn't happen until you're a good chunk through the book, which meant I wasn't really expecting the book to take the shape it did. So I kind of feel like it would have been better if we had started later and then flashed back, rather than sort of getting one set of events and then skipping really far forwards and sort of not quite knowing why, because it meant the kind of tension didn't exist until like a substantial part through the book. I don't know, but regardless, I do think there are some really interesting themes in here. I especially like the way it kind of writes about nature and trees, and the kind of connection that some of the main characters feel towards trees and apples. I know that sounds quite weird, but actually it's done really, really well in here, and it really, really works. It is quite grim as well, I would say. It's certainly the grimmest of the Tracy Chevalier books I've read so far, although there are a few bits of hope in it, but it does deal with some pretty dark themes and a very, very dysfunctional family. But yeah, it was an interesting read, but not my favourite Tracy Chevalier. On to a historical novel not set in 19th century America. Here is The Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Society by Mary Ann Schaefer and Annie Barrows, which I was kindly sent a review copy of by the people doing the publicity for the film. I really enjoyed this novel, although I would say I don't think I was quite as blown away by it as several other people that I know seem to be. I thought it was a really engaging and interesting epistolary novel. It's all told in letters, and I thought that was done really, really well. And it is quite hard to to write a novel entirely in letters that feel like they could believably be sent as letters, but I did feel like these could be, which I thought was really, really good. I also love the character of Juliet, the central character. She is a journalist in London, and this book is set in 1946, and she is struggling to work out what to write about now that the war is over, when she gets a letter from someone who lives on Guernsey, who is part of a literary society there, asking her about a book that he owns that used to belong to her and has her name in like the flyleaf. And she ends up kind of corresponding with this literary society and learning more about the Nazi occupation of Guernsey during the war, and ends up eventually going to Guernsey to meet the society. There were a lot of things about this that I really, really loved, especially its love of literature and the character of Juliet, who is very sort of fiercely independent and really, really interesting. And I also really liked the way this book examines the Nazi occupation of Guernsey, which is not something I knew very much about and not something that is talked about that much, but was really, really interestingly dealt with here. The thing I think that slightly let this book down for me, or meant it didn't blow me away quite that much, is that in the second half of the book the focus kind of moves away from the Nazi occupation of Guernsey and the kind of darker themes dealt with in this book to a sort of more romantic plotline, which I did really like, but I think I would have preferred a book that was a bit more focused on the occupation of Guernsey, which I thought was really, really interesting. I think in general the tone between like light and dark was balanced really, really well here, but I did feel that for me, I could have done with the kind of darker themes continuing more into the second half, where I felt like actually the romance side took over. But that's just me. I did still, like I say, really, really enjoyed it. And I thought it was a really, really good and enjoyable read, and definitely made me more interested in the history of Guernsey. So hopefully that's something I might find out more about in the future. And then this month I also reread The 13th Tale by Diane Setterfield, which is my favourite modern novel, and I absolutely loved rereading this. This is my third reading, and I was hosting a read-along of it, so it was really, really lovely to read it along with a lot of other people. If you have read this book before or were taking part in the read-along, I have made a long, lengthy discussion slash chat about my thoughts of this, which I made like in a few instalments as I was rereading it. That video I will link down below, but it's heavily spoilery, so if you haven't read the book, please don't watch it. Don't ruin the glorious like twists and turns of this book. This is my favourite contemporary novel, and I love it an awful lot, and it was such a joy to reread it again and to read it with so many other people and have discussions on the Goodreads group and see what people were guessing was going to happen and stuff like that. It is about a woman called Margaret Lee who is suddenly called upon to write the biography of a famous author called Vida Winter, and nobody knows anything about Vida Winter's past. She always gives different versions of her life in interviews, and finally she says, I want to tell the truth to someone, and I want that to be you, even though you are only an amateur biographer. Margaret's a bit confused, but she goes anyway, and Vida Winter starts to tell her a story. It's a book about the love of reading and books, and it's also a gothic novel hugely inspired by 19th century literature. It's also just like such a fascinating, wonderful, twisty-turny story about friendship and weird families and so many glorious things. I love it a lot, and yeah, would absolutely recommend it, and it was such a joy to reread it again. I also read 2 books for younger readers this month. This is The Wreck of the Zanzibar by Michael Morpurgo. So I read a lot of Michael Morpurgo as a child, but I never read this one, and this was one of Nick's favourites, so he suggested that I pick it up, and I really, really enjoyed it. I read it in about half an hour. It's set in 1907, it is a historical children's book, and it tells the story of a little girl on the Scilly Islands and what happens when sort of winter storms make conditions on the islands especially bad for this little girl and her family and her brother, who is desperate to go away to sea. I thought it was really, really engaging and enjoyable, and also I really like how Michael Morpurgo sort of plays with gender roles and looks at this little girl Laura who really wants to row in a boat like the boys do and is sort of never allowed but knows she could do it just as well as them. I thought there were a lot of really interesting things going on in here, and yeah, it's definitely worth the read. It would only take half an hour of your time and was really enjoyable. And the other book for younger readers I read was The Wind Singer by William Nicholson. So I had read this as a child, but I have so little recollection of it. I remembered like 1 or 2 small details, but none of them made in the plot. But this was one of Nick's favourite as a child, so we got it on audiobook and we listened to it while we were on holiday, and I really, really enjoyed it. It's quite a weird story. It's set in a city where everyone is sort of divided into districts based on your achievements, and every year there is a grand examination, and everybody, children and adults alike, have to sit an examination, and then they are sort of graded and moved up or down a district, and if you're in a higher district you have a nicer life and a bigger house and so on, if you're in a lower district you have less good jobs, less good houses and things like that. It's about these 2 children, these twins, who have slightly magical powers and decide they want to try and change the way that the world works, and they go on an adventure. It's really, really good. It's quite dreamlike in some ways, almost like a fairy tale, but really, really engaging and enjoyable, and I just loved the main 2 characters and their families as well. And I also really liked how the book is very much about family, and although the two twins are really important, also their baby sister and their parents are really important too, and we follow what the parents are doing as well. And the parents are also as rebellious as their children against the very strict order in which they live in. They hate it too, and they have sort of acts of rebellion as well, which I really, really like. So yeah, I would definitely recommend The Wind Singer, and I'm looking forward to reading the second one in the series, which again I think I read when I was like 10, but I have no recollection of it either, so there we go. Finally, I did read one non-fiction book in September that was right back at the beginning of the month in the first couple of days, and that was The Lion and the Tiger, The Rise and Fall of the British Raj by Dennis Judd. So this was about the history of Britain and India. The history of kind of British Imperial India is something I'm really, really interested in, especially in terms of the way that it operated during the Victorian period. I'm looking forward to hopefully reading Kim by Rudyard Kipling in Victober, which I think will also kind of add to my interest in that, but I wanted to read a history book first, and so I picked up this one, The Lion and the Tiger, which was really interesting. It's very introductory. It's kind of like a 250 page, very, very zoomed out book, kind of spanning from like the 16th century to the 20th, so it isn't super, super in depth, and I did feel like every chapter I read, I felt like I would need to read a separate book on that particular time period, but it was a really good kind of overview of the history of British control in India. I'm looking forward to reading some more books about some of the topics that it deals with, especially I'd like to read some more books specifically about 19th century British presence in India, because I think that's naturally perhaps the period that interests me the most. So yeah, it was certainly a really interesting read, quite zoomed out as I say, not especially in detail, but really, really good for giving kind of an overview of the history of the British Raj. So yeah, certainly an interesting read. There we have it. Those are the 12 books that I read in the month of September. Please let me know down in the comments what you read in September and if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.